This week we talk about kinship and family relationships. The area of kinship has actually had a large focus in anthropology, cultural anthropology, and there's historical and methodological reasons for that. On the one hand, from the historical perspective, early anthropologists found that the structure of kinship was parallel to the structure of political organizations. They were looking at small-scale societies and found that you could really learn a lot through focusing on kinship. It was this area that could tell you about political organization within a culture, important beliefs and values, and so on. Nowadays, it's a lot more complicated. It doesn't totally work in large, multi-ethnic, industrialized societies. But we can still see how political structure and family relationships have some kind of connection. If you think about examples like the mafia, in which there is a family structure to this political and economic organization, and that is set apart from mainstream society. That's a way that we, in multi-ethnic industrialized societies, have a similar kind of connection between family structure and political organization of some kind. But for anthropologists in the past, they thought that family was really the main structure of society. And it continues to be an interesting area of study because families are the primary way that we're acculturated. So culture is passed down from one generation to the next through families. And you can also see it in law. So legal systems determine how personal wealth is divided and transmitted to others. So we have both a social and cultural aspect to family that has really important implications for society as a whole. So again, a primary way that we're acculturated is through families. So that's on the cultural level why we're interested in it. And then it's also an important way that goods and resources are distributed through a society as well. So that's the social level upon which we're really interested in this. Kinship is important. It organizes all of these things. And it also has a large role in marriage institutions, and we'll be talking about that in the second presentation as well. This whole week is vocabulary heavy. In many ways, the vocabulary speaks for itself, but learning these terms helps you think through examples that you're familiar with from your own community, as well as examples described in the book and examples in the film for this week. All of this is aimed at helping us understand some of these historical terms that anthropologists have used to talk about kinship, and also see a little bit more of the variety of social organizations related to kinship that exist in the world. So a key term is the incest taboo, which tells you who you can and cannot marry within a given culture. And this is important for anthropologists because this is one of the fundamental concepts within all cultures that guides kinship relationships. And in fact, they're so deep that often we don't have to discuss them because they're just unspoken, known as just the way things are. But if we look cross-culturally, we see that it's nearly universal that in all cultures it's taboo for biological parents and biological children to marry, and also taboo for biological siblings to be married. Beyond that, there's great variety. Of course, in the United States, we can talk about cousins and how laws vary from state to state. You could see a map of which states allow it and which do not currently. I believe there's 10 to 13 states that currently allow first cousins to marry within the United States. And I've also included on the page that this presentation is on further down a 30 Rock clip. So 30 Rock is a sitcom American sitcom that some of you may be familiar with. And just to give you a little bit of background, Liz Lemon, the woman who's in this image and also in the clip that I'm sharing with you, is kind of unlucky in love. So she dates all these different people at different times throughout the seasons of the show, and it never works out for one reason or another reason. In this clip, she is dating someone, and of course he happens to be a great match for her, but then she realizes that they share a common relative. So you can see what happens when she discovers this and he discovers this, and how they respond. And you can really see how deep the kinship taboo runs based on this clip as well. It's interesting to think about how in all societies all over the world are fascinated by kinship concerns. When we can see this displayed in soap operas. Of course, there's different types of dramas, soap operas, all over the world, and you could see them really exploring economic concerns, issues of loyalty, and so on. And of course, then it pops up in other kinds of pop culture as well, such as 30 Rock. So anthropologists have this way of creating a system of kinship charts, and actually I don't have that chart up here right now, but you can look in your book to see this. In Chapter 5, Section 5.1, you can see an example of a kinship chart. And a kinship chart is a way of imposing order on what actually is somewhat disordered relationships that people understand in their lives. And it's traditionally been used as a way of collecting information about family relations, personal background, and even social organization within a community. In any case, if you look at Chapter 5, Section 5.1, you can see the different symbols that are traditionally used in a kinship chart. So for male is represented by a triangle, and a female is represented by a circle. An unknown relative is represented by a square. Equal sign shows that there's a marriage. And of course the vertical sign shows that there's a child produced from a relationship. And of course there are lots of variations on how people conceive of their families. So we have to have other kinds of symbols as well, such as the equal sign with a slash representing a divorce, or if someone is deceased, the shape is actually filled in, so it's not open, it's completely filled in. And again, this whole idea of a kinship chart is a way of imposing order on kinship. Most of the time, it doesn't really work in real life. Most people have something in their family background that doesn't quite fit with this kind of imposed order on the chart. If we were taking this class in a face-to-face format, we would spend some time looking at kinship charts and producing our own kinship charts. And there's very few of us for whom a kinship chart would just very easily depict what's going on in our families using these symbols. So something to keep in mind is that a lot of what we're talking about regarding kinship in the modules and in the chapter are based on ideal types. In other words, a concept of what a family is that doesn't actually exist for most people. Still meaningful and important, but we have to remember that there's a lot of variation in each individual person's circumstances. So in thinking about the different terms that we use to talk about kinship, there's lots of kinds of kinship to consider, and particularly different types of kin. So that's what I have up here on the slide. The first one to consider is consanguinal kin, and this is kinship ties based on blood relationships. So this is the way most of us might be thinking about our kin. You know, that people who we call our kin are people who have a blood relationship to us in some way. But there's a whole other kind of kin as well, which are affinal kin, which are kinship ties through marriage, and then fictive kin, in which you have kinship ties not based on blood or marriage. These are people that you call someone who is related to you, but again, that relationship is not one of a biological relative or someone who is tied through a marriage to your family. An example of this is I have some fictive kin in my family. There are people that I call my cousins who are actually my mom's good friends' children. So they're not biologically related to me, but I call my mom's friends my aunts, and their husbands my uncles, and their children my cousins. So these would be an example of fictive kin. And I've grown up thinking of them just like my other cousins that are biological cousins, and so on. Another way of thinking about family and kinship is to recognize that we have a family of orientation, so the family that one is born into and feels affiliated with in that way. But then we also have a family of procreation, the family that's made up of reproductive partners and their children. Really, it should say partners, not pair here. In any case, these are two things that we have to distinguish from each other, and from culture to culture, they vary in various ways. Extended family, of course, we use that in everyday American speech to talk about meaningful kinship relationships that go beyond the nuclear family. And so it's going to have different meaning depending on where you are, but the idea is to have a term that encompasses the full range of meaningful kinship connections. And a clan is a shared group, a kinship group, based on claims of shared descent from a common ancestor. And this ancestor could be real or could be fictional. By real, I mean blood-related, or could be completely fictional. One way, so when we think about clans, we have to recognize that there is a social function involved, that if you have different groups who have a lot of tension between them, for example, different villages, one way to alleviate tension is to develop a clan identity, creating a family, that these different villages are connected to each other through a shared common ancestor, which again could be someone who actually existed or could be fully fictional. Clan structures, like I've just been describing, can have a really important political function as well in terms of maintaining alliances and distributing resources. For example, perhaps during times of food shortage, you would have an obligation to share with villages within your clan. And so that can be a way of organizing and conceiving of social relationships that affect the distribution of resources as well. And of course, we find that with all kinds of kinship relationships. So these kinds of identities regarding families can be very meaningful in our lives and have lots of implications for our lives as well. There are two main categories or conceptions of how kinship is organized. So communities all over the world think of kinship in these two different ways. The first is bilateral kinship, and this is kinship descent that is traced equally through both the mother's and father's family. So many American families have this kind of bilateral kinship. A person is considered to be equally a member of their mother's and her family's relatives, and the father and his family's relatives. Not every culture conceives of kinship in this way, and in fact we saw an example of this in our reading for this week. So the other form of thinking about kinship is to think of it in terms of unilineal kinship, kinship descent traced through either the mother or the father. So, of course, then we have two words, matrilineal descent, kinship including only the children of the group's woman, or patrilineal descent, kinship based on membership to one's father's group. And I believe the Trobriand Islanders that we read about for this week, the father is not considered someone who contributed to the birth of the child, so not considered a family member, though they have close ties to the children. They're not considered someone who produced the child, so we see a more matrilineal descent system there. And of course, in the film we watched for this week, too, you can learn more about how descent is traced in that example. So on a social level with kinship, one of the ways to think about how kinship is tied to distribution and resource is to take note of different inheritance systems. So the distribution of stuff is an important function of kinship groups. And one form of inheritance is called partible inheritance, and this is a form of divided inheritance. So, for example, if you have a family member who passes away and the inheritance is being divided between different children, let's say, perhaps money, then it could be divided up, and that would be a form of partible inheritance. Impartible inheritance is inheritance that can't be divided. So, for example, land, a lot of times the effectiveness of land is considered decreased the more you divide it. So it makes more sense to transmit it or pass it on in an impartible fashion, which leads us to the next term, which is primogeniture. So land is a common example of primogeniture. So in primogeniture, this is impartible inheritance in which the firstborn son receives all the family's wealth, or a particularly high amount of ratio of the family's wealth. And in this case, when you have a social structure that relies on primogeniture, there's often a lot of instability because other family members really have to scramble to support themselves. We see lots of examples of these kinship issues being addressed through our stories, our fiction, our films, our TV shows. And, I already gave an example of a TV show. If you think about the classic novel Pride and Prejudice, this is really all about inheritance. Jane Austen writes about this because of the meanings and practices associated with inheritance. Having all daughters in a family means they have to be married to people who can support them, and much of the novel is consumed with this issue. When we're thinking about kinship, we have to recognize that there's a lot of economics at stake, both in terms of kinship relationships and then especially marriage, which I'll be talking about in the next presentation.